Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. This presentation is about taking over a democratic government, and in particular, the American system. To look at this, one must first have a basic understanding of how the U.S. government is set up. It is firstly a nation of laws, as you will soon quickly see. It has many checks and balances, and one of them is the separation of the three main government bodies: the legislature, your Nancy Pelosi's in the House, and the Mitch McConnells in the Senate; the judicial, or those bought and paid for Supreme Court justices; and the executive, or the president and the White House. Looking at this from a simplistic point of view, one would say, well, we need to control 100 senators, 435 House reps, 12 judges, and 1 president. From this point, one could control the laws themselves through the legislature itself, or the application of these laws through control of the judicial system. Simple, right? But control of 548 people would be quite a task. I will say, though, that today these despots have succeeded in controlling, I'd say, roughly 85% of all of these 548 people, whether directly or indirectly. That'd be about 470 of them out of the 548. But that took them a lot of time. At first, the goal must have been to start off smaller. First, controlling individual lawmakers or judges as they became available. The controllers were probably opportunists at first. It wasn't until the 60s when we started to see large metro cities like Philly and Detroit begin to consolidate, so to speak, into large, dominant Democrat machines. It is at this time we begin to see outright theft of our elections. In Detroit and Philly during this time, it was primarily the Democrat-controlled labor unions that acted as intel networks, in so much as, for instance, getting the word out for a particular candidate, or for staging strikes or work stoppages, or for using this network to organize get out the vote and vote canvassing campaigns. And that last thing, using their network for get out the vote and canvassing, two very important things with regard to elections. Just as important as another thing I'm going to point out here: volunteer poll watchers. Let's look briefly at the Virginia election in which Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe. That election, according to the RNC, had 85% of the volunteer poll watcher shifts covered by volunteers. In contrast, in the 2020 general election, a much bigger election as far as turnout is concerned, because it's the big one with the president, this election, the RNC was only able to cover about 5% of their volunteer poll watcher shifts. That, dear listeners, is a heck of a difference. And it probably made all the difference. Now, I don't have any data on the Democrat side, but I'd venture to say that they get 100% of their volunteer poll watcher shifts, and have been for some time, covered. This is how the bloodlines were able to take control of these two early Democrat cities. Control of the fraud with their union network. And folks, don't come at me about these unions. If you were around in the 70s and 80s and old enough to read, you'd know that the unions were founded, in many cases still are, organized crime syndicates. Ever heard of Jimmy Hoffa? He was a family friend of mine. He was a ruthless dude. And so as we moved into the 80s and 90s, we see Detroit and Philadelphia continue to grow into these giant Democrat machines. All due to the network on the ground, rife with ballot harvesting from nursing homes, as proven in 2020, or outright intimidation as blatantly seen in the 60s and 70s and in 2008 in Philly, with Black Panthers showing up to chill the vote. As the 80s hit the scene, we see a Democrat move in California. And remember, folks, Cali was founded by hard-nosed miners and opportunistic businessmen, to later be followed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by lots of migration from the South, like Texas. Very conservative. And in fact, Northern California still is very conservative. But we see a move in Southern California in the mid-80s that flips many districts to blue and have managed to keep them there. For me, there's an explanation, just as there was with Detroit and Philly with the union networks. In California, it was the tech revolution and the advent of Silicon Valley and what came with it that helped push California blue. You see, first there was an infiltration into the universities in California, like Stanford is one example. And folks, I'm currently pushing my children to go into trades rather than college at this point. And most of you out there know why. But the big backbreaker for California was the creation and headquartering of many CIA-controlled tech companies like Facebook or Google, or many CIA-controlled defense companies like Lockheed Martin. With these companies being headquartered in these California cities comes much tax revenue, and that tax revenue is vital to the economy of these cities. Just ask Nancy Pelosi over there in San Francisco about that. Or maybe go to Burbank and ask Adam Schiff. So with this tax revenue comes some leverage for the CIA-controlled tech companies. This leverage could also be looked at as quote-unquote cover for the politicians to make an unpopular decision that their constituency might not like. They can blame it on the vast amounts of tax money brought into the state by these companies. And so with all this corruption and backdoor deals and money laundering, you now have a Democrat machine in charge of the state of California. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop referring to it as a Democrat-controlled city. I'm going to call it what it is, a bloodline-controlled city. Because we all know that our government has been 85% taken over by the foreign bloodline controllers, but it was the D Party that was first targeted and has since been completely taken over, and I don't exaggerate that. And then with about 80% of the R Party controlled by the same. And so we have the bloodlines take control and continuously consolidate and fan out their power throughout the state. And with this money comes shady ways for maintaining control, just as we see in Detroit and Philadelphia. Money to pay volunteers to fill shifts, money to pay harvesters to hit the nursing homes, etc. Further exerting their control over these cities. What has been described in these scenarios with Detroit, Philadelphia, and California is the early blueprint for incrementally taking over a democratic republic. In fact, it's even trickled down to state races, and since 2018, we see George Soros funding local district attorney races in cities like New York, Atlanta, St. Louis, and many, many more. Snatching even more control of our judicial system, as if controlling the top judges weren't enough. But it is much more detailed than this. In fact, this method alone, even if possible to take over the whole country, would take 1,000 years. So there must be other ways to speed this along. The first thing the bloodlines must have done was to assess how much power certain legislature positions held and set their sights on those most powerful ones. Like control of the Speaker of the House Whip, or the Senate Majority Leader, or the Senate Minority Leader, or the Senate Whip. The House Speaker controls the narrative and the agenda of the House, along with controlling all operations on Capitol Hill, not to mention third in line to the presidency. The Majority Senate Leader controls the agenda of the Senate, controlling these two positions as priority. But the Minority Leaders are far from chopped liver. In fact, they are just as important, because now you get what the bloodline controllers always strive for, the controlling of both sides. Folks, you didn't think that you had a choice, did you? All those folks standing up on that stage during those primaries, yep, all chosen for you. Your selection of people to choose from is chosen for you. Does that make sense? Now, for the most part, this would work well, but not as well as it could. So from here, we see the bloodlines begin to target the heads of many very influential Senate and House committees. As of 2017, there were 88 subsidiary bodies of the U.S. Senate, 16 standing committees with 67 subcommittees, and 5 non-standing committees. They were broken down into categories like agriculture, or one that we will talk about in a little bit, like appropriations, See, appropriations appropriates money to certain causes, a very, very important position to control. Like the Appropriations Committee for Energy and Water Development, chaired by a lady who was caught employing a Chinese spy as her driver for 20 years, Dianne Feinstein. Or maybe another really important committee to our country, like having the radical Tim Kaine in charge of our armed forces readiness and management. Or Mazie Hirono, the radical, on the Committee on Sea Power. Or buying up multiple members, like in the House, where Eric Swalwell, a man who got caught having an affair with a Chinese spy, sits on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Or the Department of Homeland Security House Committee. Now, dear listeners, not only can they control the decisions coming from these very important bodies, they can now also amplify the message and make minority issues seem to be majority issues. You see, by controlling the heads of both houses, this allows for daily press conferences and dozens of news tidbits to be printed in your name. This gives the politician a brand, makes them a household name. Then we see the same thing with the committee members and heads. They get the microphone, they get the publicity. And when the news media is all in on it, well, we can see how they will complement each other. But still, most Americans are smart. They're hip to the game, and they see through the lights and cameras, and they get out and vote for what is right. This is why the Bloodlines needed to duplicate their Detroit and Philly operations across all major supposedly Democrat-ran towns. What with harvesting and using the most recent census to ghost vote. They're even going so far as to vote for illegal aliens. This is one reason for the Biden administration and many administrations before him shipping thousands of migrants to be resettled in Republican voting towns across America. They are diluting the vote, dear listeners. But even this isn't enough, so enter the voting machines. By having voting machines programmed with algorithms, they can shave percentages of the vote at will. And with them being used in conjunction with the most recent census, one could put together a vast voter fraud organization, as candidate Joe Biden proudly claimed in September of 2020. Now, dear listeners, as these folks who continue to make head-scratching decisions for their constituency keep getting reelected, then the true Americans in those cities must start thinking that they and their views are minority ones. Setting the stage, folks, slowly but surely, to then flip states like Virginia from red to blue, like in Virginia in 2008, and how they are gradually telling you the same in places like Texas and Florida. Folks, this is what I call softening you up, planting the seeds in your head so that when they decide to take a state like Texas, because they're planning on it, folks, in the next few elections, when they finally take a state like Texas, the citizens won't be surprised. It is my belief that at this point we have had slightly more patriot presidents as we have had criminal presidents. This ratio is skewed because the majority of the patriot presidents came during the first half of the life of this country, while the vast majority of the second half of our presidents, starting with, say, FDR, have been bloodline controlled. Due to the checks and balances of this great nation, it is quite difficult for a president to go rogue and do whatever they want to do. But one of the powers that a president has seems to fly under the radar all the time, and that is the president's right to appoint leadership of many different bodies like the FBI, CIA, State Department, or the Supreme Court, or the head of the Federal Reserve, or the UN, or the NIH, or the WHO. This becomes an immensely powerful tool for the president and long-lasting. Some of these positions, like the NIH, are positions that hold long tenures, or like the Supreme Court or federal judiciaries, indefinite ones, essentially ingraining this employee into the government bureaucracy forever. And I say forever, as many of them cannot be fired without an act from God due to many of the federal civil service laws, etc., unions. This ability to appoint leaders to these positions is probably the most consequential power that the president has. Their nominees will push the agenda set forth by that president, just like how Biden appointed the proud graduate of Lenin University and communist Saul Amarova as comptroller of the currency. We see the damage that the head of a body such as NIH or the CDC could do to a country with the plandemic. They will take your rights away faster than a hiccup. But it's much of the shadiness that we don't get to see that is the scariest. Like what's being done in the back rooms of the Department of Homeland Security or the State Department. Small policy adjustments that go under the radar but have long-lasting negative effects on our country, well, with the citizens not even knowing that it's being done. If the bloodlines don't control the president, that's okay. With their control of most every other government and with control of these government bodies that we've spoken on and with their full control of the fake news media, they can control the president without having to control the person themselves, but rather they can control the events surrounding this president, like through the use of a rogue black state like North Korea or Iran. The ability to hijack the whole world and control the actions of the person sitting in the White House. Or another example could be to plan and release a pandemic upon the world. This forces certain actions by the person in the White House, as we saw in 2020. Another example is protests and unrest. This causes certain actions by the person in the White House. And when those actions are the actions that the bloodlines want you to take, then the bloodlines are then effectively controlling the presidency. I can remember telling my father and others back in the 80s that there may be a conspiracy being perpetrated by those in control. I was always met with, come on, do you know how many people would have to be in on that? Well, I eventually found the answer to that question, and I'm very surprised by it. As far as my calculations go, by controlling the most influential positions in Congress, by controlling the leaders on both sides, by controlling the 10 most important committees on both sides, thus determining where the money goes, acting as oversight, determining the direction of military, economic, and social policy, controlling justice through control of the Judicial Committee or having their hands in our most secretive intel by sitting on the Intel Committee, and with half the Supreme Court under control, and with either direct or indirect control of the president, then they can effectively control the direction of our government. This is all done through a variety of means. First is the age-old one, bribes. From there, when one cannot be bribed, they are then blackmailed. What did you think Hugh Hefner was? What did you think Jeffrey Epstein was? Sometimes by having their darkest urges presented to them to indulge in, or in other cases being set up and making it look like they did something bad. When they can't control the person at all, this is when the machines become necessary. Now they can do as they will, and they do it slowly and gradually so as to not be noticed by the populace. By controlling the top 25 members of the majority and minority party in either chamber allows for you to control the whole party. At least the D party, as since about 2010 have become basically one big single unit, almost always voting in complete unison. As the party foot soldiers must adhere to the demands from the party leaders if they want to move up through the ranks of their party, of which almost all aspire to do. This means there's only the need to control about 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans in the Senate. It's the same deal in the House, albeit a slightly larger number due to the overall size of the House compared to the size of the Senate. The bloodlines need to control about the top 50 reps from each side. That's 100, dear listeners. And 50 more from the Senate. That's 150. Throw in the president, and we're at 151 people. 151 out of 548. About 35% of our government. The next level of control needed is the federal judiciary system, which includes the Supreme Court. The federal judiciary consists of the Supreme Court, the 13 U.S. Courts of Appeal, the 94 U.S. district courts, and the Court of International Trade. There are 847 federal judge positions, all of which are lifetime appointments by the president, who fills these posts as they are vacated. Of these 847 positions, 601 of them have been filled by George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Bush Jr., or Barack Obama, all known members of the criminal syndicate, about 70% of the federal judiciary system. I contend that to control this system is probably the most ambitious. To do so, they don't need to control the majority, but they must control close to the majority, maybe a little less than half, but they must include the Chief Justice of each of these federal courts. Remember much of the controlled media like Fox bragging about all of the federal judgeships that Donald Trump got to appoint during his term? It was almost some sort of a record or something, 230 judges or so. But like I just stated, folks, the power is in those Chief Justices. And there are 112 Chief Justices in the federal judiciary, and 106 of them have been appointed by the known members of the criminal syndicate. Folks, as I stated, in the Chief Justices lies the true power. It seems as though the Chief Justices can, for instance, determine whether a case has standing, as we saw Chief Justice Roberts' conversation with his colleagues being leaked with regard to taking up the Texas election fraud case from the 2020 elections. And we see Roberts seemingly making the deciding decision through cowardice, through pressure from a possible unruly crowd who may not like the courts taking up this case. According to a Supreme Court staffer, Roberts was overheard screaming, quote, "Are you going to be responsible for the rioting if we hear this case?" End quote. So we see that the Chief Justices seem to carry a lot of weight in their respective courts, control the Chief Justices, and with the way partisanship is today, that justice will have his or her party in line with his or her views automatically. Now all we need to do is control 2 or 3 members of each of these federal courts and that Chief Justice, and you can effectively control that court. Out of the 112 federal courts, if you control 3 or sometimes 4 members of each, then we're looking at 300 or 400 people. So let's say you need to control 350 of them, including each Chief Justice. And remember now, you need to control about 150 legislatures. So we're at about 500 people. The next layer of America you need to set your sights on is corporate America. Control of corporate America is a very important piece of their overall plan. Heck, this pandemic would have been over right now in America had the various industry leaders stood up for their rights. But they are in on it. Those large corporations jumped right on board with the restrictions immediately without question, as if that shit were normal. Excuse me, but it makes me sick. You don't need every single public corporation. In fact, you need much less than that. You only need the industry leaders, and the rest follows for various reasons. Take retail industry. I saw Walmart, Kohl's, and Lowe's all jump on board with masks in many DRAN states, restricting entry, eliminating your right to conduct commerce unless you wore a ridiculous face covering of any sort on your face. None of the locally owned stores seemed to step up. Some here or there, but most just followed along. Everyone else was doing it. It must be for a reason. Not a bit of resistance from the industry leaders. And it's funny, when an industry doesn't like something like, say, voter ID law in Georgia, they will boycott and even move the All-Star game out of the state in an attempt to change a law that they felt was unjust. But when the government shut down most of America's small businesses in a rush without any regard for science, potentially destroying the lives of tens of millions of people, they rolled over and never made a peep. There's dozens of industries and sub-industries and offshoots in America, but for this presentation we want to concentrate on the most important 40 or 50. Like obviously tech or defense, or maybe energy or media, retail, food and beverage. If you can control the industry leaders, usually the top 3 or 4 in the industry, if you can control them, then you can effectively control the industry, the whole thing. You would need about 150 people to do this. When we add that to the 350 judges and the 150 lawmakers, we get 650. Now, the fourth and final layer of America that one must get their greasy hands on is Hollywood and sports or culture. And this one is very simple. First, you've already taken control of the sports organizations through the corporate America part of the takeover. Now you just need a handful of the top most popular athletes, say 5 from each major sport, about 15, and you've got yourself the sports end. You already own ESPN through Disney to help push it all along. On the other side, you've got the Hollywood CEOs already, and thus the studios. Now you just need a handful of the industry leading writers and producers. You only need about 20 or so. Throw in the top 15 most popular actors, and you've got Hollywood using 35 people. Now 35 people in Hollywood, 15 in the sports industry, that's 50. Add the 150 industry leading CEOs and you've got 200. Throw in the 350 federal judges for 550. Last, add in your 150 controlled lawmakers and we get 700, give or take. And throw in a few top generals there too, like Milley. We can still say 700. 700 people to take over the whole thing. Now, dear listeners, if there were a group of foreign nations aligned with a dangerous ideology who wanted to wage war on America, do you think that they would round up a couple million of their soldiers and hundreds of thousands of planes and tanks and float on over to the U.S. and attack it? Maybe have that escalate to a nuclear conflict, one with mutually assured destruction of the whole planet? Nobody can win the game then. Or do you think that they would instead go out and groom, bribe, co-opt, and blackmail 700 people instead? And have them infiltrate 700 important positions in government, business, and culture? Sure, it might not go as fast. It might take a couple decades, but isn't it much cleaner, cheaper, easier? I go back to the question my father asked way back when. Do you know how many people would have to be in on it? To answer his question, I think you'd need only about 700 people. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.